This is the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples, so-called colored peoples, in the history of mankind.
Welcome to the Third World. My name is Pranay Somayajula. I'm a writer, organizer, and host of Return to Bandung, a podcast that explores questions of imperialism, resistance, and internationalist solidarity throughout history and into the present day. Through historical analysis, interviews with expert guests, and deep dives into classic works of anti-colonial theory, Return to Bandung seeks to make the case for why anti-imperialist politics are as important in our current moment as ever before. Broadcasting to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota, the heartland of the American Empire, this is Return to Bandung. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are in the world, and whatever time of day it is for you, welcome back to Return to Bandung. It's great to have you here. The question of global inequality, why some nations are rich while others remain poor, has long been the subject of intense debate and discussion among scholars, policymakers, and NGO professionals alike. Nobody disputes that inequalities exist on a global scale, with the richer countries tending to be those who are located in the global north and who are former colonial powers, and the poorer countries tending to be those who were themselves formerly colonized. But why those inequalities persist even in a supposedly post-colonial world continues to be hotly debated. The dominant way of thinking about global inequality, perpetuated through media narratives and political discourses and mainstream academic frameworks, leads us to think that these inequalities are somehow natural, that some countries are just by their very nature more predisposed to prosperity, while others are predisposed to remaining in cycles of dependency and poverty. Of course, this is a deeply problematic narrative for a number of reasons. It reinforces Eurocentric and Orientalist and frankly racist narratives about the Global South, who are of course overwhelmingly the countries trapped in cycles of poverty and underdevelopment. Moreover, it completely fails to account not only for the role that centuries of colonial plunder and exploitation played in enriching the global north at the expense of the global south, allowing for this divide and this global inequality to open up in the first place, but it also fails to account for the role of neocolonialism and continual relations of unequal exchange and exploitation that have continued to keep global South countries in dependent and impoverished positions even after achieving supposed political independence. To help think beyond these mainstream narratives and to really unpack the root causes of global inequality and its relationship to imperialism, both past and present, I'm joined today by Jason Hickel. Jason is an economic anthropologist who serves as professor at the Autonomous University of Barcelona's Institute for Environmental Science and Technology, as well as a visiting professor at the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics. He's authored and co-edited numerous books on development, political economy, and ecology, including The Divide, Global Inequality from Conquest to Free Markets, published in 2018 by W. Norton, and more recently, Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World, published by Penguin Random House in 2020. Now, before we begin today's interview, if you enjoyed this episode and you want to support Return to Bandung, please do take a moment to subscribe to the show and leave a review or a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever app you're listening to this on. It only takes a few seconds, and it really does make a difference. Please also take a moment to follow us on social media. We're at Return to Bandung on Instagram and Twitter, and share the show with anyone in your life who might benefit from hearing the revolutionary, anti-imperialist perspective this show hopes to bring. Now, with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get into it. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm a big fan of your work. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while now. We have a lot to cover today, but before we do that, would you mind telling the listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work?
Yeah, so I'm a professor at the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And I'm also affiliated with the London School of Economics as a visiting professor, which is also where I taught for several years while I was living in London. My research focuses mostly on global political economy, imperialism, both past and present, and also ecological economics and eco-socialism. And I've published a couple of books on these topics, including The Divide, and also more recently, Less is More. I should also say that I'm not a solitary worker. I work with a team of 10 or 12 PhD students and postdocs who are brilliant. These people are based with me at ICTA in Barcelona, and it's a really cool international team, and we do a lot of our work together. So a lot of the work that we'll probably be talking about today actually comes from collaborative efforts with this group.
That's wonderful. I've actually first, I think, encountered you in the context of your ecological work. I think I learned about Less is More before I learned about The Divide. My friend had given a copy of it to me as a gift, which I have not yet gotten around to reading, but when I do, would definitely love to have you on for another conversation to focus on the more specifically these ecological questions. And then when I discovered more recently your work on inequality and the political economy of how some nations get very rich and others stay very poor, and so many people who are doing work on that issue completely sidestep the question of imperialism, but you really face that head on because, of course, you can't paint an accurate picture, as we'll talk about, without talking about imperialism. I was very impressed with that aspect of your work and wanted to bring you on to talk about it. So I guess that's a great segue into the first question I have for you, which is, I've done several episodes on the show over these last few months covering various aspects of the political economy of imperialism, broadly speaking. I had my conversation with Jayati Ghosh about imperialism and development. I had my conversation with Ndongo Sambasila and Farwa Sial about the international financial architecture, with Radhika Desai about dollar imperialism, and so on. But this is the first episode where I've really had the chance to take a step back and take more of a bird's eye view of global inequality, economic inequality specifically, and of course the role of empire and imperialism in shaping it. And this is a topic that you cover in your 2018 book, The Divide, Global Inequality from Conquest to Free Markets, which I highly recommend for any listeners who are looking for a very accessible sort of primer crash course in these topics. And in the introduction, you write, quote, "It is easy to assume that the divide between rich and poor countries has always existed, that it is a natural feature of the world." And you point out that, quote, "This notion sits at the center of the usual story that we are told about global inequality." And then you go on to write, "But the story is wrong. The idea of a natural divide misleads us from the start. In the year 1500, there was no appreciable difference in incomes and living standards between Europe and the rest of the world. Indeed, we know that people in some regions of the global south were a good deal better off than their counterparts in Europe. And yet their fortunes changed dramatically over the intervening centuries, not in spite of one another, but because of one another, as Western powers roped the rest of the world into a single international economic system," end quote. And I chose this quote to start us off because I think it provides a really powerful framing for the kinds of topics I want to touch on in this conversation. And so with that in mind, my first question for you is a very big picture question, which is, what does the mainstream narrative about global inequality, the narrative that we're taught in school, that we see in the media and in the news and so on, what does that narrative get wrong or leave out about the historical and present realities of inequality and of imperialism's role in it? And what would a more accurate or holistic narrative look like?
Okay, so that's that's a huge question. So there's a lot for us to talk about here. So let's see. So there's this dominant narrative out there about inequality, which basically, the core tenets are basically like this. First of all, the fates of rich nations and poor nations are due entirely to endogenous conditions, right? So things occurring inside those nations, almost as if they're individual separate islands unto themselves and disconnected from the rest of the world. Then rich countries become rich through their own hard work and their good institutions and their scientific advancements, et cetera. And poor countries are poor and remain poor because they're backwards and corrupt, or they have cultural deficiencies of some kind. There's lots of very clearly racist arguments going on here. Or they're just, in the most neutral representation, just behind on the ladder of development, right? And so the implication here is that if poor countries just work hard and implement the proper capitalist policies, they'll eventually climb the ladder of development and catch up to the rich countries, right? And of course, there's an additional element here, which is that rich countries, according to this mainstream narrative discourse, give benevolently of their surplus in aid, right, to help poor countries up the development ladder. So really, the rich countries here are the good guys, and poor countries depend on them for their largesse. So it's a simple and powerful story. It seems to explain the world in a way that kind of makes sense on the surface of it for most people. But the reality is that all of this is fundamentally incorrect and is effectively propaganda. In fact, is designed as propaganda. And this goes back to Rostow and other key figures from the US State Department who produce books promoting this kind of narrative, right? So in reality, global inequality and the phenomenon of underdevelopment and mass deprivation in the global south is due fundamentally to capitalism, right? It's an effect of how capitalism structures the world economy. It is not an accidental byproduct of capitalism, but rather a fundamental feature of it. And so I think that in order to understand what's going on here, we have to understand a few basic things about capitalism, right? So for capital, which controls the means of production, the objective of production is not to meet human needs or to achieve social progress or anything like that. The objective is to maximize and accumulate profits, okay? Now, to sustain a process of perpetual capital accumulation, capital requires an ever-increasing quantity of inputs, and it has to achieve those inputs, has to obtain those inputs at the lowest possible price. And this is in the form of cheap labor and cheap nature, to use the terms from Jason Moore and his colleagues. Now, the problem here is that this kind of process entails very severe contradictions, right? So if you intensify the exploitation of your domestic working classes, you'll obviously eventually face a revolution. And if you intensify the exploitation of your domestic resources, you're eventually going to undermine the ecological basis on which your production ultimately depends. So it's very clear that this kind of economy cannot continue for very long within a bounded arrangement, right? A bounded economy. Capitalism requires some kind of outside, right? An external frontier where it can exploit and obtain cheap labor and cheap nature with impunity, where it can externalize the social and ecological costs of capitalist production, and where it can suppress and violently crush any rebellions that may occur, right? But by the very nature of its structure and its logic, capitalism requires an imperial arrangement in order to stabilize accumulation. So imperialism in this sense is not like a side gig of capitalism, like an unnecessarily violent mistake committed by an overly greedy ruling class, right? It's a structurally necessary feature of capitalism. It structures the capitalist world economy. And this is exactly why, at the very moments of the rise of capitalism in Western Europe during the long 16th century, European imperialism gets underway. And this is so important to understand, right? There's no temporal or analytical distinction between these two movements, capitalism and imperialism. They are one and the same projects. They merge for the same reasons at the same period in time with the same actors, right? So we know that, the rise of capitalism in Western Europe relied utterly on the appropriation of resources from the colonies, right? So this is not about the rise of capitalism due to its good institutions and England's scientific advances and so on. No, we're talking about massive appropriation from the colonies during the exact same period, the use of enslaved labor on an astonishing scale. England was trafficking human beings for over 200 years, right? European colonizers went abroad to every continent, systematically destroying local indigenous industries and reorganizing the South's productive capacities, right? Their land and their resources and their factories and their labor away from servicing local human needs, their national development objectives, and instead towards servicing consumption and accumulation in the core, right? So in fact, this is the central objective of the colonial project. You can wipe away all the other explanatory narratives about colonialism to the side. What it was ultimately about was about reorganizing production in the global south around the interest of accumulation in the core. So unsurprisingly, this creates massive underdevelopment and deprivation across the global south during a period of their integration into the capitalist world system, right? It enriches the imperial core, and it leads to extreme levels of global inequality between countries, specifically the core and the periphery, that had never existed before in history, right? So this is where the divide, this is where global inequality comes from. And for listeners who are not familiar with these terms, core and periphery, these terms come from world system analysis. And the core here refers to The organic core refers to England and Western Europe, and the broader core refers to also the European settler colonies, right? So the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, later on Japan, also Israel, right? And these are considered the core nations today, with the periphery being the rest of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So just to give a sense for the extent to which industrialization in Western Europe depended on this process, let's take Britain, for example, okay? And I like to use Britain because I taught for a long time in the LSE with British students, and I realized there's actually a lot of ignorance about what happened during Britain's industrial rise. We're always told it was powered by the textile industry. Let's take that at face value, okay? Now, the ability of the British textile industry to achieve its profits and outcompete the rest of the world in this industry, which it succeeded in doing, depended entirely on a massive, steady supply of cheap cotton. But an astute observer will note that cotton does not grow in Britain or anywhere else in Europe, right? The British had to obtain it from the global south, specifically from land stolen from indigenous Americans and with the labor of enslaved Africans. So cotton was cheap for Britain, but not because cotton is naturally cheap, but rather because it was effectively stolen, okay? So we're talking about millions of people working in conditions of slavery and indenture or exploited wage workers in the periphery in order to fuel Britain's industrialization. So right away, the mainstream narrative of this is all about the success of the rich countries is due to endogenous conditions completely falls apart. That is an ahistorical and apolitical narrative that is completely rejected, in fact, by economic historians, by any reasonable political economy research. And we can tell the same story really about virtually every other major Western industry during this period of capitalist consolidation, right? They all relied on massive appropriation of labor and resources from the global south. I mean, take the automobile industry. The automobile industry was enabled entirely by rubber. Where does rubber come from, right? Over and over again, we can see the same thing occurring, like the British tea industry. I mean, there's no such thing as British tea. The Swiss chocolate industry, no such thing as Swiss chocolate, et cetera, et cetera. To say nothing of like the gold and silver that was plundered on a massive scale from Latin America and Africa. Now, okay, so the capitalist world economy was structured in this imperialist way, right? Core and periphery. But this arrangement, and this is important to understand, was forcefully challenged during the 20th century. So there's a real turn in history during the middle of the 20th century. You have radical anti-colonial movements arising across Asia and Africa and Latin America, mounting major opposition to their colonial occupiers, and they succeeded in overthrowing them, right? An extraordinary story of success. And immediately upon achieving political liberation, then they set about pursuing strategies of economic sovereignty. And this is really what we can refer to as the Bandung moment, right? Referring to the title of your podcast. So most of these movements were actually inspired in some way by socialist and communist ideas, which provided the kind of blueprint for the process of reclaiming national control over productive capacities and organizing them, instead of servicing elite accumulation in the global north, organizing them instead around human needs and development objectives, right? And we can see this in the policies they implemented. They used land reform, they nationalized their resources and their major industries, they used subsidies and tariffs to develop their own national industries that could compete on a world scale. They used capital controls, and they used planning processes to build public services and develop their industrial capacities, et cetera, et cetera. And importantly, they were incredibly successful as a result of this. Incomes and consumption in the global south increased dramatically. Social indicators improved for the first time in hundreds of years, because during the colonial period, of course, no such progress was achieved. So it really was a period of a development miracle in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But for the core states, this had a dark side, right? I mean, this is excellent for the global south, but for the core, there's a major problem. Because remember, we've established that capitalism requires cheap labor and cheap nature. It cannot function without that. So economic sovereignty in the global south means that basically Southerners are now consuming more of their own labor and resources, right? And so those labor and resources are no longer so cheaply available for consumption and accumulation in the core. And this destabilized the imperial arrangement. It led to increasing supply prices for northern capitalists, and it made capital accumulation in the core states very difficult to achieve, right? This was a major crisis that occurred in the 1970s that really caused shockwaves through the ruling classes of the core. So, of course, they retaliated, right? I mean, they effectively faced a choice. Either we accept this decolonial movement and we shift to a more equitable world economy, but as a result, we'll have to abandon capital accumulation and shift to some kind of post-capitalist economy, right? Or we try to maintain capital accumulation by restoring the imperial arrangement, okay? And they opted hard for the latter. And they did this in two main ways. First, they intervened militarily to remove the progressive leaders in the global south that had been brought to power by the anti-colonial movements. And we see bloody and violent coups occurring during this period, right? The Western-backed coups deposed Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, right, in 1961, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, deposed by the British in 1966, Sukarno in Indonesia, a key leader of the non-aligned movements, the anti-colonial movements during this period, deposed in 1967, Salvador Allende in Chile, deposed in 1973, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso in 1987, and over and over and over again in Western-backed regime change operations, removing these progressive anti-colonial leaders and replacing them with dictators backed by the West who were more amenable to Western economic interests and rolled back the socialist and developmentalist reforms of the 50s and 60s and 70s. So the coup was a major tool in the arsenal of the imperialist powers to restore the imperial arrangement. But they also retaliated by using the World Bank and the IMF to impose structural adjustment programs across the global south. Now, this is an important part of the story. And a lot of people will glaze over at the mere mention of structural adjustment because it sounds so incredibly boring. But let me tell you, this was absolutely crucial to reconstructing the imperial arrangement of the world economy. Structural adjustment forcibly removed all of the progressive and socialist policies that the global south governments had been using and reorganized southern economies once again as subordinate suppliers of export goods to the global north within global commodity chains dominated by big firms from the core states. Okay, so basically, again, instead of producing for domestic consumption and national development, the South was made to once again produce sweatshop goods and raw materials, et cetera, for Western consumption. So,
and just as a reminder for listeners, I know we've talked about it before, but just to define that term, structural adjustment, that's referring, of course, to these conditions that are placed on governments, primarily third world governments, receiving loans from the IMF and World Bank that say as a condition for these loans, for these bailout funds, you have to implement all sorts of really punishing austerity measures and neoliberal reforms, slash social spending, roll back labor protections, and open up your country for penetration and for exploitation by foreign capital in order to make it more quote unquote market friendly. And that just ends up reinforcing these patterns of dependency and exploitation in really, really devastating ways.
Exactly. I mean, that was exactly the purpose of the structural adjustment programs. It's interesting because the dominant narrative will say, no, the structural adjustment was to improve the economic conditions of the global south, et cetera, et cetera. These are all lies. The purpose of structural adjustment was to roll back the gains of the anti-colonial movement, and specifically the socialist countries, all of whom were structurally adjusted, almost all of whom were structurally adjusted in the 90s, with the exception of Cuba, right? So basically, and I think this is quite important, right? So structural adjustment is the method of imposing neoliberalism across the global south. This is crucial because people will often think neoliberalism is kind of this unfortunate phase of capitalism. Capitalism is fine. It just took this kind of dark turn. If we could just go back to the golden age of capitalism, it'd be fine. No, neoliberalism was imposed in order to maintain the conditions for capital accumulation in the face of the decolonial struggle. Okay, it's crucial to understand neoliberal reform as a backlash against the anti-colonial struggle. So this basically restores the imperialist structure of the world economy, right? But without the need for overt military colonial occupation. And it rescues capital accumulation and growth in the core states, right? So it resolves the crisis of stagflation that they had faced in the 1970s. So great for the core. We see massive increase in profits and growth, but it had devastating consequences for the global south. We're talking long periods of decline and stagnation. In some regions, we're looking at 15, 20 plus years of crisis, right? Which is almost unfathomable. Like for us in the core states, if we have 2 years of recession, then we consider this to be a major blow. We're talking about 20 years in some cases, right? So this contributes to a massive explosion in core periphery inequality. And so if we want to talk about global inequality, we're looking at the long 500-year history of capitalist colonialism setting the stage for this, right? Organizing the world economy like this. An insurgency from the global south, which dismantles this arrangement, and then a backlash from the core, which reestablishes it and sets the engines of global inequality running once again. So I guess in summary, to answer the question in the shortest possible way, we have to recognize that global inequality is not a natural feature of anything. It's rather an artifact of the particular political economy, right? The particular power plays of capitalism on a world scale and dynamics of capital accumulation.
I know I gave you a very difficult task with starting off with such a large question, but I think that the scope of your answer really does go to show how you cannot talk about this topic without taking this broad 500-year view of history and looking at how capitalism has developed inextricably intertwined with imperialism to the extent that they are functionally the same thing. Of course, this was, Lenin's contention that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. If you want to talk about inequality, you have to talk about capitalism, and therefore you have to talk about imperialism. And something that I pulled out of your historical overview just now was that it might be useful to think about this in sort of taking place in two stages, right? Because as you mentioned in that quote I read out at the beginning, 500 years ago, there wasn't this divide that what is now the global north and the global south, those societies all existed at a very similar level of development. In fact, global south societies actually tended to be more prosperous, and so the divide worked in the other direction. And this initial stage is when capitalism is emerging in tandem with classical colonialism, this age of empires, right, that we think of direct colonial rule, that sort of sets the stage for this divide to open up and widen over the course of a few centuries, because these societies in the colonized world are being plundered of their resources, their labor. They're not being allowed to develop their own indigenous industry, the sort of expertise, the technical expertise or infrastructure capacity they need to have any sort of economic self-sufficiency. They're being denied all of that development. Meanwhile, the wealth being siphoned away from them is being used to facilitate Europe's development, and then, of course, America's development as well, like you mentioned with the role of the slave trade. And so that creates a condition that by the mid-20th century, even though you suddenly have this moment of decolonization and that era of formal colonialism comes to an end, colonialism is just one of the many forms that imperialism can take. And these countries have been already placed at such a structural disadvantage, right, that it just transitions into what, of course, Kwame Nkrumah called neocolonialism as the form that imperialism takes in the modern world, where even though these countries then are politically independent and are self-governing, they're still economically dependent and in the subordinate position because the divide is already opened up. There's already such vast inequality, and the global economic system has been structured in such a way that the processes of extraction, plunder, exploitation continue. It's just that it's now happening in arguably an even more insidious way, because it's happening under the guise of supposed independence for these countries, that they're supposedly entering into these, trade deals and economic relationships of their own free will, when, of course, we know it's nothing of the sort. I mean, the same goes for how the way people talk about, people blame the poor in the United States for their position, right? That if they just worked harder, they're choosing to work in these low-paying jobs. They could choose to go get educated and get a higher-paying job, as if it's that simple, when we know it's not. I mean, that same logic, I think, really does apply on a global scale. And I really can't stress enough for the listeners just how pervasive these, as you said, deeply racist and colonial narratives really are. I think about, like, in mainstream discourse today, I mean, I think about back in, was it 2017, right after becoming president of France, Emmanuel Macron gave that speech where he was talking about the problems facing Africa today, the problems of development, of governance, and so on. Of course, Africa, a continent where France had a truly enormous and horrifically brutal colonial footprint, and he said that Africa's problems were, in his words, civilizational. I mean, this idea that inequality is natural, this is not just being repeated by, some like fringe white supremacist blogger. This is the president of France saying that. It's such a pervasive and mainstream viewpoint that I think it's so important to have scholars like doing the work that you're doing of challenging that narrative. To sort of follow up on and dig in a little more deeply into sort of the mechanisms by which this inequality is perpetuated, particularly in our current moment of not colonialism but neocolonialism, I want to talk about unequal exchange. Back in July of this year, you published an essay for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation titled "How Unequal Exchange Shapes Our World." And in that essay, you write, quote, "Systematic price inequalities mean that for every unit of embodied labor and resources the South imports from the North, it has to export many more units to pay for it. This leads to what the Egyptian economist Samir Amin called a hidden transfer of value from South to North. Hidden because there's a monetary balance of trade, but in reality, the South is sending a net transfer of real value to the North. This enriches the core, but drains the periphery of resources necessary for development. Global South economists like Amin and others describe this as unequal exchange, arguing that it enabled a continuation of imperialist appropriation from the periphery, even in the absence of formal colonial rule." End quote. Now, this term, this concept of unequal exchange is one that listeners may have heard of, but it comes up a lot in these sort of discussions, especially in Marxist and anti-imperialist circles, of the relationship between empire and global inequality. I was wondering, for listeners who aren't so familiar, if you could elaborate a bit on what exactly this term unequal exchange means, why it's important to understanding the current economic system, and also if you just could speak briefly to a sort of intellectual genealogy. You mentioned Samir Amin, but who are some of the other important thinkers, schools of thought, etc., that have contributed to the development of this concept?
Yeah, okay. So unequal exchange to me is a really crucial concept. It was developed, I guess, most clearly in the 1960s and 1970s in the work of Marxist economists who were associated at the time with dependency theory and also world system theory. In fact, unequal exchange is like a core element of world system theory. And most of these thinkers were based in Latin America and North Africa. Probably the most famous people in this field were the Egyptian economist Samir Amin, who you mentioned, also the Brazilian economist Roy Mauro Marini, and then also Arguiri Emmanuel, who was a French economist who was actually very closely connected to third world struggles. And then, of course, Emmanuel Wallerstein, the kind of, in some ways, I guess, kind of godparent of world system theory. And their basic point was basically this, right? It was very obvious that during the colonial period, the core was relying heavily on a massive direct appropriation of resources and labor from the periphery. And this was, as we described earlier, crucial to enabling rising levels of consumption and accumulation in the core, okay? So direct transfers, effectively. But what these theorists argued, right, was that the basic dynamic of colonial appropriation continued to occur even after the colonies achieved formal political independence. And it happens because of systematic price inequalities in international trade to a degree that cannot be explained by productivity differences, right? So basically, like, wages in the periphery are much, much lower than wages in the core in a way that can't be explained by their lower productivity, okay? This occurs because the core states and firms intervene to compress the prices of southern exports relative to the prices of northern exports, right? Now, when it comes to international trade, this becomes important because all imports have to be paid for with exports. So again, as you said when referring to this piece, for every unit of labor and resources embodied in the imports that the South brings in from the North, they have to export many more units of their own labor and resources, their own cheapened labor and resources to pay for it. And this leads to that hidden transfer of value, right? It looks like a monetary balance of trade because the price balance is equal. But because of the price inequalities, in reality, there's a net transfer of value from the South to the North that enriches the global North economies, but drains the periphery of real resources and value in labor, right? So I guess the other way to state this is that the global South basically consumes less than it produces, okay? Because a good chunk of its production is being drained away, uncompensated, right? And the global North consumes more than it produces because it's effectively not paying fully for its consumption. So Samir Amin and the others in this school of thought basically saw this as a major, if not the key driver of uneven development and inequality in the world economy.
And just to give sort of a concrete example, because even I struggle with, these are such abstract, like we're talking about trade and the balance of trade and exports and imports is so abstract. But to give a very concrete example of this, think about a very average working class person in the United States. So not making a lot of money. So working class person, how many hours do they have to work in order to be able to afford a new iPhone? And then think about how many hours does a working class person in, say, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, maybe a miner who is working in the mines, mining the rare minerals that are needed to make the iPhone, how many hours did they have to work in order to be able to afford that iPhone, right? Will they ever even be able to? Just to put that in very concrete terms, I mean, the value of the iPhone is exactly the same. It's not that an iPhone is more valuable in Africa than in the United States. It's the same product, but because of the structural setup of the world economy for us here in the imperial core, we have to give less hours of our labor in order to be able to then exchange to afford that product compared to someone in the global south who is involved in the production of that product, especially we're talking about the people mining the minerals used to produce it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. So basically, there's lots of ways that the core states and their firms work to suppress the prices of labor and resources in the periphery, right? One major way, actually, is through structural adjustment programs, which we were discussing earlier. So we know that the structural adjustments basically gutted labor laws in the global south, right? They made unionization more difficult. They slashed environmental regulations. They massively cut public sector employments, creating a huge reserve army of workers driving wages down. They also constrained monetary sovereignty in the global south, which limited the ability of global south governments to use public finance, to hire workers to do public works, et cetera, et cetera. So basically all of this kind of reduced the relative cost of southern labor and resources. And we can actually see this empirically. We can see directly how structural adjustment it dramatically increases the price gap between the global south and the global north. And as a result, we also see empirically in the research that we've been doing a huge increase in south-north transfers that occurred during the 80s and 90s, right? Directly during the period of structural adjustment. So this is not a theoretical exercise here. We're talking about a direct relationship between an increase in these transfers and the structural adjustment programs that were imposed. Another way that these price inequalities are achieved is through monopoly power in global commodity chains, right? So basically, the core states monopolize the most advanced technological processes and the high profit production processes, and then they outsource the highly competitive and low profit production to the global south. And so think about, again, the iPhone is a good example. So the intellectual property is monopolized by Apple, for example, but the actual production is outsourced to the global south with several different suppliers who then have to compete with one another brutally, driving down their own prices and their wages in order to sell to Apple. And Apple effectively dictates prices to them because they're locked into these supply chains, right? So the effect is that Apple gets to jack up its parts of the prices in that supply chain through its monopoly power, but through monopsony power, which is basically where you're the only buyer of a product and people have to compete to produce it for you at lower prices. Prices are squeezed in the global south, and therefore the value of the iPhone, right, which is produced, by the way, entirely in the global south. Let's not beat around the bush here. All of the materials, all of the labor, right? Most of the engineering is actually done by workers in the global south with resources from the global south. The iPhone is produced in the global south, and yet the vast majority of the profits and the value from the production of the iPhone is accumulated in the core. It shows up as GDP in the global north, even though the production takes place elsewhere, right? It's completely wild. And this is what the economist John Smith refers to as value capture. So we talk about GDP as value added. No. I mean, some of it is value added domestically in the US, but the vast majority of the value add is actually occurring in the global south and then captured through these mechanisms of unequal exchange in commodity chains in the global north economies, right? So a huge amount of unequal exchange today actually happens through these wage disparities in global supply chains. So now we're at the point where documented wage inequalities is so massive that we have extremely high-skilled workers in India and China, right? We're talking about scientists, managers, logistics engineers, etc. Highly educated, highly skilled, at the top of their game, receiving a fraction of the wage that low-skilled workers like retail assistants and transport drivers, etc., receive in the USA or Britain. A fraction of that, okay? So we have a paper that came out recently in Nature Communications, which I wrote with Morena Hanbury-Lemos and Felix Barber. It's called Unequal Exchange of Labor in the World Economy. And in that paper, we show that workers in the global south receive about 90% less in wages than workers in the global north for work of equal skill in the same sector. So this is wild because this is against what capitalism suggests it's about. which is free competition such that prices equalize, et cetera, et cetera. No, prices don't equalize. And they don't equalize precisely because of imperial arrangements that lock global South workers into highly competitive, very low wage, highly productive also labor in the global South, while the profits and the value gets accumulated in the core.
Thinking specifically about the sort of inequality in wages for very highly specialized, highly skilled technical labor between the core and the periphery, that then of course leads to this problem of brain drain, right? I mean, if you are a engineer or a highly skilled scientist and a researcher, and you're making much less money in, say, India, which is, I mean, again, my family is from India, and this is in some ways the experience of my own parents who are both scientists by training and came to the United States for graduate school and stayed here, that you, of course, you're going to then immigrate to the core where the wages for the same work and the same level of specialization and expertise are so much better. The economic prospects are so much better. Maybe working for the same tech companies that have massive data centers or outsourcing infrastructure in India, but working for that same company, you'll get a much better deal if you're living in the Bay Area than if you are in Bangalore. And that brain drain, it adds up over time. And that, of course, then reinforces the dependency of these global South countries whose best and brightest are being incentivized to leave those countries and then go contribute to the economy of the imperial core. I mean, that's yet another dimension of this unequal exchange that I don't think gets talked about as much, but is, again, very, very insidious and really contributes to this much larger problem. Now, everything that we've been talking about here is dependent on a really high level of integration in the global economy, right? Like you said, I mean, the iPhone, its IP is owned by an American company, Apple, but it's produced by suppliers in countries across the global South, right? Production's happening in China, but the mining of the minerals is happening in African countries. And there's just so much integration. This is, of course, the result of decades of neoliberal globalization that really kickstarted in the 70s and 80s. Coinciding with the structural adjustment onslaught against the third world and the forcible integration of these countries into the capitalist and imperialist world system that has created a really high level of interdependency in global economic relations. But of course, the moment we're living in right now is a moment of really profound, I think, crisis in that highly integrated global order, because these contradictions of neoliberalism, especially if we're thinking about how that has contributed to the decimation of industrial manufacturing here in the US or Western Europe and the widespread economic devastation and despair that's caused, right? It's generated a really strong nationalist backlash across the world. And governments in the global North and the global South are increasingly retreating into trade protections, hardening their national borders, because of course immigration is another, as I mentioned, major sort of byproduct of this, and other expressions of nationalist politics. We're seeing that, of course, here in the US with Trump and the trade wars, the anti-immigrant crackdown, but also we're seeing this nationalist resurgence in the global South as well. And in some cases, that's taking the form of a more progressive nationalism oriented around securing national sovereignty, but in other cases, like for example with the BJP in India, it's taking a darker and more reactionary form. But generally, there's this nationalist upsurge around the world that is, I think, throwing a wrench in the works of this globalized global economy. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to how you see these changes affecting the dynamics of unequal exchange between the core and the periphery.
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, let me deal with the question of so-called reindustrialization in the US and in the rest of the West, right? I think this is so funny to me because like during the Obama years, I think it was, Obama was like, we have to bring Apple production back to the USA, and Apple's captains of industry were like, look, this is just not going to happen, because it's not just that Apple's production and profits rely on low-wage workers in the global South, but also you actually literally cannot find sufficient engineering labor capacity in the USA, right? It's just not being produced through the university system, et cetera, anything like the scale necessary. The second thing is this, right? So Trump now, he talks about reindustrialization, bringing, industry back on shore, et cetera. Look, the only way that could plausibly occur is if the US had some kind of effective industrial policy, which it absolutely does not, right? US industrial policy is laughable. Like the US is looking at China's industrial policy with deep envy. I mean, China's been able to use industrial policy to make leaps and bounds in terms of their developments of strategic technologies in electric vehicles and AI, et cetera, right? Very effective. I mean, the key power of industrial policy is that it enables you to overcome the limitations of the capitalist law of value, right? So instead of allowing capital to dictate what to invest in other words, whatever is most profitable at the time, you have a longer term plan about what kinds of industries you want to build, regardless of their profitability, right? China's been able to use that as a socialist country in order to achieve very rapid industrialization in key sectors. The US wants to reindustrialize, but this is not going to happen as long as capital is in charge of production, because it's not profitable to do that, right? So the only way it could plausibly occur is with industrial policy, which is against the interests of the US capitalist class, and that's why it's not occurring, right? The US is completely captive to the interests of its capitalist class and cannot think beyond their objectives. Now, even if we imagine that they did somehow achieve reindustrialization, the only way that's going to be profitable is if they massively crush wages and living conditions for the working classes in the US and elsewhere in the West, right? And I think that this might be what the basic, effectively the fascist capitalist consensus around the Trump administration might actually be, which is that we're going to try to do this, but the only way to make it work is to crush working class wages. And you can already see elements of this happening, right? And so this is where, clearly the working class in the US has been duped by the claims of Make America Great Again, because the whole project is going to hinge on dramatically exacerbating class inequalities in the US. But let's think about what's happening in the rest of the world. I think that, clearly we're seeing a kind of insurgent South in some aspects, right? The most obvious form of this is China. And this is an effect of, again, its industrial policy. In China, production is overwhelmingly determined by the objectives of the national development plans, okay? China has national control over its major investment banks, has big public policy banks. It can guide investment towards whatever it deems necessary for meeting its social and ecological and other national development goals, and is very successful at that. Now, as a result of this, particularly under the era of Xi Jinping, which is pushing China in a more socialist direction, right, and reversing many of the market reforms of the 90s, China is experiencing a dramatic increase in its wages and its price levels. And as a result, because remember, unequal exchange relies on price differentials. As a result, Western appropriation from China through unequal exchange is declining dramatically, right? We can see this very clearly in the data. And in fact, to the extent that there is a decline in the scale of net appropriation from the global South over the past decade, it is almost entirely due to one country, and that is China. Now, the West is deeply upset about this and has entered into a posture of extraordinary aggressive warmongering and anti-China propaganda and disinformation right now. And this is amazing to see, because even just let's say 15 years ago, there was more or less a kind of general sense of cooperation on the part of the Western capitalist class when it comes to the question of China. But now that is changing really dramatically. What has changed is wages, right? So China is no longer a low-wage economy, but U.S. firms are deeply integrated in the Chinese economy, rely heavily on Chinese labor and engineering talent, et cetera, Chinese resources and so on, and that is pinching off their profits now. And the West is desperate to intervene to push wages and prices back down in China. And of course, the way to do that is through sanctions, which they're implementing already, which is, by the way, backfiring brutally on them, but also through regime change. This is the classic tactic that the West has always used against sovereign-seeking states. Regime change followed by de-development, right? Deconstructs the basis of economic sovereignty. That's what the West wants to do to China, and they are gearing up massively to do this, including by surrounding China with U.S. military bases. And this is wild. There's this crazy discourse in the West about, oh, China poses a military threat. This is incredible propaganda, right? China has one foreign military base, which is in Djibouti. The U.S. has 800 foreign military bases, 200 of which directly encircle China. So if anyone is a threat here, it is the U.S., which is clearly building up military capacity with a planned future invasion of China for the purpose of bringing China back in line, restoring the imperial arrangement.
I mean,
of course,
I think, sorry, not to cut you
off.
off, but just to I could really drive that point home, because I think it's so hard for us sitting here in the U.S. to really grasp the scale of not just the U.S.'s military presence, 800 bases around the world, but the scale of encirclement that we're currently engaged in against China, and just how regularly the U.S. conducts naval exercises a few hundred miles off the coast of China, whether it's joint exercises with the Philippines, with South Korea, or whatever, right? And these are military exercises that are essentially war games that are going through the motions of war with China, and the Pentagon knows that they're planning for war with China. China knows they're planning for war with China. And just imagine if China sent its navy to conduct military exercises a couple hundred miles off the coast of LA or Seattle or San Francisco, just think about what the US's response would be.
Think about it.
But China's an imperialist power because they're trying to defend their sovereignty in the South China Sea. It's ridiculous. I mean, it makes you feel like we're living in the Twilight Zone.
We are living in the Twilight Zone. It's so wild to me. I mean, you'll see like front page stories in major Western newspapers about, oh, China is conducting military exercises in the South China Sea, right? I'm like, mate, it's the South China Sea. Like, come and talk to me when they're doing military exercises on the coast of Florida. But it's the US who's actually conducting military exercises on China's border, right? And actually, this brings me to an important point that I want to make sure I hit on, which is the role of US proxy states, so-called allies, like Japan and South Korea. This is crucial. Like, I mean, South Korea is a really important example here, I think, because for defenders of capitalism as a mode of development, one of the key examples they'll give is South Korea, right? All of this talk about how the global South is locked into underdevelopment because of imperialism, these are all lies, because look at South Korea. South Korea has managed to achieve really rapid developments and has now reached the level of the advanced economies, just like the Western politicians and their economists said in the 1950s and 60s. So let's look at South Korea, right? South Korea is a really interesting case because South Korea was purposefully supported by the USA in the second half of the 20th century to use state-led development policy and industrial policy to build up their economy, policies that were denied to the rest of the global South, but which we know to be successful, right? So South Korea was not made to go down the road that the rest of the global South was forced to go down, and furthermore, was purposefully integrated into the core, and all of this for US geopolitical strategy, because the US wanted, effectively, a military base on the border of China, which it now has in abundance. In fact, I think there's something like 60 US military bases and installations in South Korea alone, including, by the way, the biggest single foreign military base in the world, which is Camp Humphreys, controlled by the USA, with missiles bristling towards China. So I think it's important to understand that these key elements of, let's point to Taiwan and South Korea and the other Asian tigers, etc. No, these are purposefully integrated into the core, just like Israel, by the way, purposefully integrated into the core states for the purpose of US geopolitical strategy. We all know how Israel operates as effectively an attack dog for US policy in the Middle East. And so we can see how these exceptions to the imperialist structure, these apparent exceptions actually prove the rule. And I think that's quite important to capture.
Absolutely. And for listeners who want to dive more into this specific role that South Korea plays as a proxy state of the US, I encourage folks to listen to an older episode, but the interview I did a while back with Jia from Noted Dole about imperialism in Korea, both North and South. And we talk a lot about the way that South Korea has functioned and continues to function as a proxy state for US empire, specifically as a counter against China. I want to turn now a little more specifically to your work on these issues and the research that you've done, Jason. In 2021, you co-authored a paper in the journal New Political Economy with scholars Dylan Sullivan and Huzaifa Zumkawala titled Plunder in the Postcolonial Era, Quantifying Drain from the Global South Through Unequal Exchange, 1960 to 2018. In this paper, you write, quote, "We find that in the most recent year of data, the global North, advanced economies, appropriated from the South commodities worth $2.2 trillion in Northern prices, enough to end extreme poverty 15 times over. Over the whole period," and that's 1960 to 2018, you write, quote, "Drain from the South totals $62 trillion, constant 2011 dollars, or $152 trillion when accounting for lost growth," end quote. These are really staggering numbers, and I honestly find it a little difficult to wrap my head around them. But this is, I think, a really groundbreaking study. You know, I led an anti-imperialist summer school lecture series in DC earlier this summer, and I referenced that study quite a bit to sort of give a sense of the scale of this unequal exchange and this drain from the South. So I was wondering if you could say more for the listeners about what the study was, how you and your co-authors went about actually conducting this research and calculating these numbers, and just dig into the findings a little bit more and how you think they challenge dominant ways of thinking about the global economy.
Yeah, so this paper is based on a particular method that was developed by an economist called Gernot Kohler. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I'm not quite sure, but I've never met him. But in turn, Kohler was building on methods that were proposed by Samir Amin. Now, importantly, Samir Amin was crucial to developing the theory of unequal exchange, but at the time, in the 70s when he was writing, he didn't really have access to the necessary data to demonstrate his point empirically in very convincing ways. And this is actually one of the reasons why neoclassical economists basically rejected him, right? But everybody else, of course, knew that Samir Amin is right. I mean, you get to see that it's clear. And he was able to use kind of some illustrative cases and so on. But Gernot Kohler was one of the first people to really develop a method to assess this empirically. And so we used a modification of his method, updating it for more recent data and other information that we have available. And it's based basically on the discrepancy, okay, between market exchange rates and purchasing power parity equivalence. Okay, now just to explain what's going on here. Technically, when we talk about PPP dollars, people have probably heard about these things, purchasing power parity dollars. These are basically like, it's a way of representing goods and services in the world economy in terms of US prices. Okay, so take the price of a loaf of bread or an iPhone in the USA. What's the price of that? That's the PPP value of those same things, a loaf of bread or an iPhone, in any other country in the world, right? So it takes care of the question of exchange rates and price differences, et cetera, et cetera. However, what we can see is that the Global South's exports are actually traded at market prices below their PPP values. So this is a representation of what Amin was saying when he talked about there being a price disparity, right? Southern prices are compressed, and we can see this by looking at their market exchange rate prices being much lower than their PPP values. By contrast, in the global north, market exchange prices and PPP values are more or less aligned. So there's very little distinction. So what this means is that when the South exports its goods at market exchange prices, they're not getting in return the full PPP value price for what they're selling. And what that means is they're basically transferring real value for free to the global north. And so by using that discrepancy between market exchange and purchasing power parity, and then comparing that to the volumes of trade between the global north and the global south, we can determine exactly how much free value the south is sending to the north. Now, so it's true those are big figures. But what I want to emphasize here is that this is a conservative method that actually underestimates considerably the scale of unequal exchange for a couple of reasons. First, because it only looks at goods that are involved in direct bilateral trade, okay? So for example, it only looks at goods shipped between a global south country and a global north country, rather than accounting for goods that may be shipped from one global south country to another global south country and then later on to the global north, right? So intermediate trade. And second, because it only looks at the goods themselves and ignores entirely the upstream inputs to those traded goods, okay? So in more recent work, we've tried to account for both of these aspects using newer methods, using input-output models to take these aspects into account. And what we can do using this approach is actually measure the south-north transfers in terms of real resources and labor. And using these methods in two recent papers, we found that in the final year of data, the global north net appropriated from the global south 12 billion tons of materials, 21 exajoules of energy, more than 800 million hectares of embodied land. That's land that goes into the production of land-based goods. And then 826 billion hours of labor from the global south, net of trade, okay? Now, these numbers are huge. It's impossible even to understand what they represent. But one way to think about them is in terms of what real resources and labor can actually do, right? So that quantity of materials and energy that I've just mentioned would be enough to develop the infrastructure in the global south that would be required to provide universal healthcare, universal education, modern housing, heating and cooling systems, refrigerators and freezers, washing machines, sanitation systems, clean cooking stoves, public transit, internet, mobile phones, et cetera, to the entire population of the global south, right? Abolishing human deprivation and meeting human needs at a good standard, right? That's what those resources and that labor could do. But instead, all of that productive capacity is instead appropriated to fuel corporate growth and capital accumulation in the north, right? So very concretely, you can imagine these goods flow in the terms of, let's say, sweatshop garments for Zara and H&M, or like sugar for Coca-Cola, et cetera, et cetera. Like these are productive capacities, labor, land, resources, factories that could be used instead to build housing and sanitation systems in the global south, furthering national development, but instead are appropriated away from the South. And so as a result of this, we can see that human deprivation is in the global South is entirely avoidable. It exists only because those resources are appropriated, right? This is amazing. It's such an important fact. The global South is rich. It is rich in resources, in productive capacities, in labor. It's only that its people are poor because they are deprived of control over those productive capacities. And that's what has to be resolved through anti-colonial struggle. Now, I guess one thing I want to add here is that measuring the monetary value of these transfers is a bit trickier, but we do have a paper that is currently under review and which we hope will be out soon with one of my postdocs called Kan Onder, who led this paper, which actually assesses the monetary value of northern appropriation from the South through global commodity chains, which is how most of trade takes place. And we find that these transfers are worth up to about $10 trillion per year, right? Now, this is because basically we're looking at the extent to which global South workers are producing the value, but that value is being captured through global commodity chains in the global North. If that value is distributed back across the global commodity chain on the basis of who is actually contributing the labor, then we would see the global South would be up $10 trillion per year and the global North would be down $10 trillion per year. So this is a way of giving you a sense of the scale of the monetary value of the appropriation that we're seeing. But stay tuned for the paper, which I think will elucidate this more.
Thank you so much. And I will definitely link this and other papers that you mentioned in the show notes for listeners to check out, because I think you're doing really crucial work to put these concepts into very concrete terms. And it is just mind-blowing to think about what development in the global South could look like if, as you said, that land, those resources, that energy, that labor was put to the development of these economies in a way that could actually meet human needs rather than lining the pockets of Western capitalists. This is exactly what I mean when I talk about how hundreds of years of colonialism denied these societies the ability to develop not just their GDP growth, but develop the infrastructure, the technical expertise, and so on needed to achieve economic sovereignty. And even now, even though these countries have their own governments, their own flags, they're politically independent, they're no longer colonized, they're still denied that right to development because they're being plundered of their resources, their energy, their land, and through these processes of unequal exchange. And in addition to these studies that you mentioned, you've recently, as part of this work on quantifying inequality and unequal exchange, you launched a very exciting new project. It's a website, a sort of database called globalinequality.org. I will, of course, link that in the show notes, which is congratulations on getting that URL, by the way. That's a good one to have. And it's a really great website that it synthesizes and offers visual representations through graphs and charts of really important data on a wide range of topics relating to international political economy. It covers, there's charts and graphs about global economic inequality, of course, but also about things like the relative responsibility that the global North and global South countries have for climate breakdown and so much more. And again, when I was doing this anti-imperialist summer school and making the slideshows for those lectures, I drew very heavily on a lot of these graphs and so on. And I think it's a really valuable resource. So I'm wondering if you could just tell the listeners a little bit about this project, where the idea for it came from, what you're hoping to accomplish with it, and also of the various facts and figures that you've compiled on that website, if there are any that you find especially staggering or especially illustrative of these broader points that you're trying to make in your work about global inequality and the imperial world system.
Thanks. Yeah. So this is a collective project that we started about 5 years ago. It's taken so long to complete. It was started with my co-author, Huzaifa Zimkawala, who's based in Pakistan, and then also a good friend of mine, Federico Cruz, who's an activist based in Mexico. And what we wanted to do was basically create a platform that would make data on imperialism and global inequality and unequal exchange, et cetera, accessible to a broader audience with interactive graphics that people like you could use in your presentations. And so I'm so glad to hear that you've been doing that. And we struggled for years to get this off the ground, but finally we launched it recently. And in addition to the three of us who conceptualized the idea long ago, it evolved into something much bigger. So there's lots of people who have been involved in producing the content, and it's become kind of a platform for our broader research team, which I mentioned at the top of our interview, to kind of publish their key results that are emerging from their papers. Like, these are PhD students and postdocs. It's a really international team. People from Brazil, Mexico, India, Turkey, Cameroon, doing some really exciting work. Most of it is still in review or planned, but it's going to be coming out in the next couple of years. We'll be adding new pages to the website. So it's kind of a work in progress, and it's a living document that will continue to evolve as new work comes out. But yeah, I encourage people to have a look at it and see what you think. In terms of particular striking bits from it, it's hard to pick, really. I mean, there's a page that looks at core periphery inequalities in terms of income, which is, I think, really quite striking because it really gives you a sense for the sheer scale of accumulation in the core states, and particularly in the hands of the 1%, and how the vast majority of it's actually crazy, the vast majority of global production actually goes to lining the pockets of these people. So, I mean, it's actually kind of enraging to see. There's also a page on unequal exchange. There's a page on gender inequality in the world economy. And then throughout, we try to make reference to the key thinkers that have inspired this work, mostly from the Global South, from Samir Amin to Eduardo Galeano to Ali Kadri and the Putnakes and so on. So hopefully it's a useful resource for people.
Absolutely. Again, I really encourage listeners to check it out. I know it's something that I, with some various writing and research projects I've got coming up, as a resource that I plan to be drawing very heavily on. And I think as a tool that, political educators like myself and so many of my comrades can continue to benefit from in the years to come. Jason, you've been really generous with your time. I know we've been chatting for more than an hour now. Before I let you go, I'm going to ask you the question that I close out all of my interviews with, which is, who is an anti-colonial thinker, leader, or revolutionary from any point throughout history who inspires you, and why?
Okay, so this is really hard, actually, because there are so many. Intellectually, I'm inspired by lots of thinkers. Definitely Samir Amin, who we've talked a lot about. Also Walter Rodney, Utsa Patnaik. I think everyone should read the Patnaik's book, Capital and Imperialism. I think it's crucial. In terms of politically, I would say that one key figure for me would be Thomas Sankara. There's a really amazing story around his life and legacy. I definitely recommend that your listeners have a look. He was the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso. In the 1980s, he recognized the extent to which debt was being leveraged to force Global South countries into structural adjustment, and he saw explicitly that this was an arrangement designed to restore the imperial structure of the world economy. And he wanted to resist this by coordinating with other Global South leaders, specifically other African leaders, to default collectively on their debt, right? Recognizing that, in his very powerful words, if we default on the debt, if we don't pay the debt, then nobody gets hurt. If we do pay the debt, then we end up dying, right? It was an incredible moment of rebellion that inspired millions across the continent and elsewhere. And 3 months after making this fateful speech in the halls of the African Union, he was assassinated in a French-backed coup and replaced with a stooge of French and Western interests who governs as a dictator for the next several decades. What's amazing about Sankara is that they basically made a lesson of him. Yes, it's true that technically you can default on your debts, but if you do, you might lose your head. And this is a threat, effectively, that the rest of the Global South leaders had to basically internalize. And I think there's an important lesson for us now, which is that if we are to mount a second wave of insurgency against the imperial system, and we can see movements in this direction already, we have to be cognizant of the kind of violence that they are willing to inflict in response. And we have to strategize around that in order to prevent it, right? And so if you look at the Sahel states right now, which are breaking from imperial hegemony, they're very heavily inspired by Sankara, and they took his words to heart, right? They knew that if one of them was going to break, then they needed the support of the others, and they created defense pacts, which made it much less likely for France to invade when they started kicking the French military out of their countries. So this kind of South-South solidarity, which Sankara called for, is the crucial linchpin of anti-colonial struggle in the 21st century. This is a lesson that we have to take on board to increase our defense deterrence and build alternative institutions in order to take this struggle to the next level. And so I think that he's a really crucial figure for us going forward.
I could not agree more. He is someone who I think anyone who calls themselves a revolutionary, anyone who calls themselves an anti-imperialist absolutely needs to look up to and take inspiration and also take lessons from. And, in that speech that you mentioned where he says that if we don't pay, then the creditors won't die, but if we pay, we will die. In that same speech, he also says, addressing other African heads of state, if you don't join me in this refusal to pay, then I will not be here to speak at the conference next year. And then, of course, as you said, 3 months later, he was murdered. He knew exactly what the stakes were, and you're right that the leaders of the Alliance of Sahel states in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, I think they understand that, which is why that there's been an emphasis on this regional integration and collective defense, not just trying to build a project of securing sovereignty within one country, because history has shown us that unfortunately, when we're up against forces as powerful as the US, as NATO, as the imperialist bloc, that is just a really difficult thing to pull off. Well, for the listeners, I will leave you today, as always, with some revolutionary wisdom from Walter Rodney, the Guyanese Marxist revolutionary intellectual theorist of imperialism and its role in development and underdevelopment. He, of course, famously wrote How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And the quote that I'll share with you all today is from a talk that he delivered titled The Roots and Consequences of African Underdevelopment, delivered in May of 1979 at a symposium held by UCLA's Center for Afro-American Studies. And in that talk, Rodney said, quote, "To me, the real threat from a third world perspective, the deeper meaning of the multinational corporation, is not merely that it transfers values from the third world to the center, not merely as an exploitative mechanism, but the way in which it continually reinforces a certain integration, a certain international integration with the center, located, of course, in the metropolitan world. Because what is a multinational? Essentially, by integrating resources from a whole variety of territories, third world as well as metropolitan, it has a capacity to control the destiny, not merely the economic destiny, but the well-being in the broadest sense of the word, of so many of the peoples of Africa and the world at large." Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this episode of Return to Bandung, please be sure to subscribe to the show and leave a review or a 5-star rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please also follow us on social media. We're at Return to Bandung on Instagram and Twitter, and be sure to share this episode with anyone in your life who might enjoy listening. And of course, if you have any questions, feedback, ideas, or suggestions, please do get in touch at returntobandung@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you.